All right. Hi there. I'm Ezra Brainerd, and I have chosen Gideon for my study for this week. So, to start with his background, Gideon was the fifth judge, being preceded by Othniel, Ehud, Shamgar, and Deborah. This placed him right in the middle of this epoch of Israelite history. And he was a Manassite of the family of Abiezer, and he lived in the town of Ophrah. And that placed him on in West Manasseh because the Abiezrites were one of the families that received their inheritance on or west of the Jordan, and being from the town of Ophrah put him about right there. And as we see throughout the book of Judges, Israel had fallen into the same pattern that we see throughout the whole book, this pattern of sin, judgment, usually judgment by war, and oppression, and then repentance, and finally deliverance. And previous to each of the six major judges was a period of oppression. The oppression previous to Gideon was the shortest, being only 7 years, but in many ways it was quite possibly the most brutal. Rather than just being heavily taxed, as was the case with some of the situations, the Midianites actually made annual, possibly even more frequent, raids through the land of Israel, and they took all the spoils they could get, and what they couldn't take, they destroyed. And we see that in Judges 6:4, where it describes this. It says, "So they would camp against them and ruin the produce of the earth as far as Gaza, and leave no sustenance in Israel, as well as no sheep, ox, or donkey." Now, if we back up in the story of Israel, remember the golden calf. After the golden calf incident, God told Israel that he would not go in the midst with Israel, lest he consume them. Exodus 33:3. After Moses had interceded, God conceded, and he said, "My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest." Exodus 33:14. Now, in Gideon's day, Israel had again turned to idols. And Gideon, in many ways, is quite reasonable in assuming that God had left them, as he describes. And to make things worse, God sent an anonymous prophet. But the message of the prophet wasn't an extremely hopeful message. It was simply and purely a rebuke. But the fact that the prophet's message wasn't hopeful didn't mean that the situation was hopeless. The next thing God did was call Gideon and promised Gideon that he would be with him and instructed him to take down the altar of Baal. And although God had promised victory over his enemies, Gideon still feared his friends too much to obey God during the day. And rather than tearing down the altar of Baal in the day, he did it at night. And this other picture we see on the right of the screen is a stele of, actually, I don't even know, that might not be the correct word, but it's a picture of some sort of a depiction of Baal. But this fact that Gideon tore down this altar of Baal at night is the first lesson of faith that I want to bring out, because true faith is not the complete lack of fear of man. True faith is when the fear of God is able to overcome the fear of man. And so here we see faith in Gideon, though it was weak faith and he feared man and was too afraid to just obey God immediately and tear it down in the middle of the day, yet he still had the faith to still accomplish the task, and he did it at night. And in this, Gideon demonstrates obedience in spite of fear. But Gideon also demonstrates obedience in spite of doubt. Gideon was certainly a man of faith. I don't think anyone reading Judges would deny that. The author of Hebrews certainly got that idea and recorded him in Hebrews 11 recorded him in the hall of faith. And yet Gideon's faith was not without wrinkles or weakness. And yet this fact of Gideon's weakness actually helps us understand what faith is and helps us bring it down to our situation and gives us confidence that in the end, God's mighty works are not based on our mighty faith, but on his goodness. And so again, we see that true faith is not the lack of doubt. True faith is the willingness to follow God in spite of our doubts. And so we see this in Gideon. Gideon needed reassurance every step along the way. He was almost as slow to take up this task of deliverance as Moses was to take up the task of delivering Israel from Egypt. But as you read through the story of Gideon, you notice that in spite of all his slowness, in spite of all his requests for signs, God didn't actually get mad at him as he did at Moses, because the one thing where Gideon stopped short is he never actually asked God to send someone else. In spite of all of his weakness, in spite of the weakness of his faith, he always did take that step, even though he asked for many signs. And so here's a graph of Gideon's army. Gideon, after he took down the altar of Baal, he blew the trumpet and he called the troops together, and 32,000 men responded. But Gideon was still fearful. Even with quite a large army, he was still fearful. And Gideon still doubted, and he asked God to give him a sign. Not once, but twice. Gideon's faith, though real, was a weak faith. And then, after God had diminished his army to 10,000 by instructing them to let the fearful go home, as it was actually instructed in the book of Deuteronomy to do, after the fearful men left, Gideon was left with an unfearful army of only 10,000 men. And yet, God was going to diminish his army one more time. And here's where we find that well-known story of the different ways that they drank from the water. And God picked the 300. And Gideon was fearful when he had 32,000 soldiers. And he asked for that sign, not once, but twice. But now God had diminished his army to only 300. But this time God volunteered a sign for Gideon. And God told Gideon to go down to the outskirts of the Midianite army. And he heard one soldier telling another soldier the dream of that barley loaf that rolled down the hill and tipped over a Midianite tent. And the other gave the interpretation, and he said, "This is Gideon." And upon this, Gideon gained the confidence. And he gained full confidence that God had delivered this vast army into his hands. So here we have another lesson on faith. With 32,000 men, Gideon was fearful. Even after getting 2 positive signs from God, Gideon was still fearful. But when God volunteered a sign with only 300 men, Gideon had confidence and finally took the bold action and attacked. And so here we have it. 300 men executing God's plan is more than 32,000 on Gideon's plan. And so he returned that same night. When he heard the dream, he went back, he returned, and he took those 300 men and he executed that famous strategy of placing a lantern inside a pitcher and carrying the trumpets. And he divided them up into 3 bands, sent them 100 men in each band, and instructed them to follow and do what he did. And these 300 men circled the camp, broke their pitchers, blew their trumpets, and shouted. And God caused that multinational army to panic and begin fighting with themselves as they fled. God routed the Midianites, and we see then Gideon's ferocious and relentless personality by the fact that he pursued his enemies in a multi-day chase. And even though 2 towns that he came to and asked for provisions for his armies refused to feed him, he continued hungry and thirsty and without getting any help from these towns that he passed through. And he continued relentlessly with only 300 men pursuing these vast armies. And he pursued until the 2 enemy kings of Zebah and Zalmunna were dead at his feet. And then, after this victory, we see another good quality in Gideon. We see that Gideon was humble. We see Gideon's humility by the fact that when the nation offered that he should be king, he, his son, and his grandson, that he refused. He refused that offer of being made king. And we also see Gideon's humility in the way he pacified the Ephraimites when the Ephraimites came and complained that he hadn't called them. And rather than being harsh, he used a soft answer and he turned away wrath and maintained at least a certain amount of unity among the tribes. But not everything was positive. We also see Gideon's failure. We see Gideon's weakness by the fact that he made a golden ephod and instigated a form of worship that God had not authorized. This ephod was not an idol and was never intended to be worshipped itself. I assume that Gideon considered it some kind of remembrance for the great victory that God had wrought. And yet it's so strikingly similar to the story of the golden calf, where Aaron had asked for the golden earrings. And here Gideon asked the same thing. He said, all those golden earrings that you've gotten, throw them to me in a pile. And he made this golden ephod. And in this, Gideon instigated a form of worship that God had not requested. A form of worship, not only a form of worship, but he instigated worship in a place which was not the place where God had placed his name, as we see in Deuteronomy 12:5. So in all this, we see a man that God had chosen, a man of great qualities in certain aspects and also great failures in others. And yet God used him, and his faith, though feeble, was still real faith. And God wrought a great victory through Gideon.